Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. We've all been rightly appalled by yet another school shooting, this time in Uvalde, Texas. There's so many troubling aspects to this. The number of children murdered, the profile of the shooter, and the behavior of the law enforcement officers. As ever, there are cries to do something, which really means do something about guns. Yet the gun law now in Congress won't do anything to prevent future school shootings. There's a lot of evidence to show why it won't work, especially when existing gun laws appear to cost more lives than they save. Dr. John Lott, my guest today, knows more than almost anyone else about this subject. Dr. Lott is president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, a PhD in economics. He spent 25 years in research and is author of many books on the topics, including More Guns, Less Crime, which kicked off this debate, and Gun Control Myths. John, let's start with this. You write that between 1950 and 2019, 94% of mass public shootings in the United States occurred in places where general citizens were banned from carrying guns. But the mainstream media, they continually refuse to mention when an attack occurs in a gun-free zone.
Right.
I think that's Uvalde's yet another one of hundreds of instances. Thoughts?
No, exactly. I mean, the Texas the Tulsa, Oklahoma hospital shooting was another example. You read the manifesto for the Buffalo mass murderer there. He goes and spends a great deal of time in his manifesto explaining why he wanted to pick the particular target he did. He wanted to go to a place where he knew victims there, the civilians, wouldn't have concealed handguns to go and protect themselves. We have many of those examples where we've gone and read through the diaries or other statements that these killers have made. These people may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to try to go and get media coverage. And they know the more people they kill or wound, the more media coverage that they're going to get. The Sandy Hook killer, for example, he had spent 2.5 years studying mass public shootings over the previous 40 years. He had done what the police described as akin to a doctoral dissertation. Among the things that he did was he would graph out the relationship between the number of people killed and the amount of media coverage that they got. According to one police report, he wanted to go and kill more people than the Norway killer had killed, who had murdered just with guns 67 people, because he wanted to get more international news coverage than the Norway killer had gotten.
Well, the typical blowback on that is, well, these are suicides. These shooters are planning to commit suicide. What do they care? But what you're showing is that they really do care, that they want to live in infamy.
Exactly.
And they drive the numbers up. They'll get their whatever in heaven, or not in heaven, in hell.
No, exactly. You can't read these diaries or other things that these people leave and not come away with the, obvious fact that they want to commit suicide, but they feel unappreciated. At some point along the line, people discovered that if they went and killed a lot of other people, they would get attention, that people would know that they had been here. And so if you're going to stop these attacks, what you have to do is try to take away the coverage that they're going to get. And I'm not talking about banning the First Amendment or something like that, or rewriting it. But if you can get somebody there quickly with a gun to stop them, it can reduce how many people they think they're going to be able to go and kill. It's
You point out that even in right to carry states or in concealed carry states, that they still have very tiny pockets of vulnerability, the so-called gun-free zones.
Right.
And most schools are in the gun-free zone category, and that's like putting a sign on the school saying, this is open for target shooting.
Right. Exactly. Look, let's say, God forbid, somebody was threatening you or your family, was really seriously threatening you. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said this home is a gun-free zone? Would the, you know, prospective murderer go and say, well, I can't go in there because I can't take my weapon in there because I'm not allowed to do it? No, what would happen is the exact opposite. It would actually serve as a magnet for that person to go in there because he knows he'd be relatively more successful. It would be an easier task for him to go and do it. But look, people know they would never put a sign like that up in front of their home. Well, if you're not going to put a sign like that up in front of your home, why would you put it up in front of other places that you really care about protecting? I understand the debate. You know, you read the legislative debates over things like allowing teachers or staff to be able to go and carry. And there's a whole range of concerns. You know, what happens if the teacher accidentally shoots somebody? What happens if the teacher loses their temper and shoots somebody? What happens if the teacher loses control of a gun and the student gets a hold of it? Those are all possibilities.
Well, go ahead.
Those are all possibilities. So much of the gun control debate is about possibilities, about things that might happen. But we don't have to guess. We have 20 states that to varying degrees have teachers and staff carrying. Some of them have had it for decades. And you can go and look to see. And you don't find one single example of any of these types of concerns actually occurring in the thousands of schools that have teachers and staff carrying.
Well, you're making a case, a statistical case. I think, to me, part of the problem is this. Most people are not very numeric. Most people don't do that well in math. And you're making if you look at the statistics, they overwhelmingly support the idea that guns make you safer, not putting you at more risk. And what we see is when you get a bad anecdote, a kid kills himself with a gun in a closet, then all of a sudden we're supposed to ban all guns in all closets, and we're supposed to have trigger locks. And those laws that are supposed to protect people are aimed at incidences which might be 1/10 of 1% of the number of lives that might be saved by not having gun locks, by not having
Right.
a lot of the laws. So even our existing gun laws, which are meant to so-called protect people, end up hurting more people than they save.
A lot of these are empirical questions to try to go and figure out what the net effect of these things are. I mean, I can look across countries, for example. We have data on what's called hot burglaries. These are burglaries that occur while the residents are in the home. Burglars in the United States spend about twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. And what's the reason that they give? They're worried about getting shot. And one way to try to protect yourself and prevent yourself from getting shot is make sure nobody's home, because then nobody's there to fire a gun at you. The British burglars don't care about that too much, and they also break in a lot more. So, look, as you mentioned, I'm an economist. One of the things there are a couple of ideas that economists have, but probably one of the simplest is just that if something's more costly, people do less of it. The greater the reward, the more they do of it. And if you make it costly and risky for criminals to commit crime, either with higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates, or in terms of the fact that a victim might be able to go and defend themselves, you can also make it risky for them to commit those crimes and reduce it.
Well, I suffer from the same issue you do. I studied finance and statistics, and so I tend to look at these things in terms of cost trade-offs and benefits. And I mean, your statistics are overwhelming in terms of the concealed carry, for example, allowing guns in public spaces, which would prevent the mass shootings. But you've gotten a lot of pushback. You paid an enormous personal price for this. I mean, you were an economist at the Federal Sentencing Commission, and then you were at Walton as a professor. And when you published your first book, More Crimes, or More Guns, Less Crime, uh, everybody came out of the woodwork and began attacking you. Tell me what that was like, and who were the opponents, and what were the lines of attack?
Oh, it's a long story. I mean, I guess the most important part of the story is it basically ended my academic career at the University of Chicago. Um, my book, More Guns, Less Crime, came out in May 1998. In November 1998, Mayor Daley called up Hugo Sonnenschein, the president of the University of Chicago, and spent, I'm told, 45 minutes talking about all the wonderful projects that the city wanted to do with the school. And then at the end of the conversation said, but Lott's continued presence at the University of Chicago was going to do, quote, irreparable harm to the relationship between the city and the school. A couple days later, I get called into Dan Fischel, meeting with him and another professor. And Dan basically said, look, John, you're probably one of the worst treated people in academia. I'm really sorry to have to do this, but we're going to have to let you go. And I said, this is in the middle of the school year. You can't do this in the middle of the school year. And he said, you'll destroy my career. So anyway, I'm not going to go through all the back and forth, but after a few days, the agreement was that if I promised not to talk to the media anymore about my work, they would let me stay there through the end of the school year. So if you kind of look from like May, when the book came out, until November, I was doing a lot of media. And then I basically go radio silent. You may not remember, but in 1999, there was a lot of push on new gun control laws. I would get a lot of calls from Max Boot, who was the op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal at the time, saying, John, you got to write a piece for us. Okay. So I ended up going to Yale. And then the second year I was at Yale, I was asked to testify in Hawaii on a couple gun registration licensing bills that they had. And before I went there, I'm sorry if you wanted me to stop.
Well, no, it's interesting. I just wanted to point out, I'm not doing this to put you through your personal hell again, but the cancel culture that we're seeing today with regard to, pick a topic, vaccines,
Sure.
different views on Ukraine, whatever, it started a way back, back.
Oh, yeah, no.
And you were an early victim of that.
Right. But I'll finish the story about Yale, and then I'll give you like a story from the Los Angeles Times, which is also relevant. So anyway, before I went out to testify in Hawaii, I told the state legislators who were inviting me out, look, you're going to have the Honolulu police chief testify in favor of the bill. You don't want to sandbag them. You want them to be able to go and do research on this, but tell them in advance that there are two questions that you want to ask. One question is, how many crimes have you been able to solve since registration and licensing went into effect in 1960 in Hawaii? And the second one is, how much does it cost each year to go and run the program? I basically knew the answer to the first question. And so anyway, he gets there, and because I wanted to force him to be able to answer the question. I didn't want him to be able to say, well, I'll have to look at it and get back to you. So anyway, he gets up there and testifies. And he said he'd looked and he couldn't find a single crime that they've been able to solve as a result of licensing and registration. And, I can kind of go through and explain why that's the case if you want. But then he also was asked, how much does it cost? And he said it costs about 50,000 hours worth of police time each year. So, the trade-off is, at least if you could point to thousands of crimes that you had solved, or hundreds, or a couple dozen, or at least one or two, then there'd be some trade-off. But 50,000 hours of police time each year, that's a lot of crimes that you could have solved with 50,000 hours worth of police each year. So, the cost benefit there, you could just feel the air go out of the room. But, you know, and one last story about the LA Times. I used to write somewhat regularly for the Los Angeles Times for like 4 or 5 years. And, you know, I have a few pieces in a year or whatever. And then Nick Goldberg, who was the op editor at the time, called me up and he said, you know, John, when we run your pieces, we get about 10 times more mail and emails and phone calls than we get from anybody else, which is good. You know, they hate you, but it's good that we get that. Apparently what had happened was George Soros's Open Society and a couple other groups would organize these types of campaigns that were there. And Nick put up with that. But then he said when they weren't getting a response from him, then they would start contacting the publisher. And when he would run one of my pieces, the publisher would basically call him in to the publisher's office, and he'd have to spend like a half hour or an hour dealing with that. And he said, John, I just don't have time to go and spend an hour in the publisher's office explaining to him why we ran your piece when we do that. So he just said, we're not going to be able to run your pieces anymore. And I've had that same type of story happen time after time in different types of outlets across the country. You know, and the thing is, people didn't have like specific things saying Lott is made a factual mistake or something like that. They just would say, you have to stop. You know, it's horrible that you're running his pieces. And anyway, it just
well, let's speculate. You're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Dr. John Lott, who's a very, very thoughtful expert on the effect of gun control on crime and guns and crime, and we're talking about that. And we're also talking about the incredible blowback he got for coming out with what I believe is the truth about guns. You know, John, you've been at this now for almost 3 decades. I want to speculate. I mean, what is it? Is it just people are uncomfortable with guns and they're afraid of guns, and so therefore anything having to do with it is verboten? Or is there something deeper going on about, is it a Second Amendment issue where they really don't want America to be armed at all, and they being, I guess, the elites? And is this, how much of this do you think is political, and how much of you think is just personal aversion to guns?
I think there are a lot of aspects to this question. As a general point, I think there's a fundamental difference between conservatives and liberals in terms of who they trust to make decisions. So you take something like Obamacare, all right, or how liberals approach healthcare issues. Obamacare, they basically tell you exactly what the insurance has to cover. They don't trust the consumers to decide what you're going to be covered. The only choices you have is the size of the deductible that you can pick between the different types of plans that are there. You know, a conservative basically would say, look, you know, a 65-year-old woman probably doesn't need to be covered for childbirth. You know, if you want to go and have, you know, alcoholism covered or something like that, or other issues, that's your choice, you know, and you pay for it. It's more costly to have all those other things covered, but, you know, you may have other things you want to go and do with your money. And, but, you know, if you don't trust individuals to make decisions on even what their health insurance is going to cover, are you going to trust them with weapons? I mean, in some sense, the ultimate thing you can trust people with is in terms of whether you trust them with a weapon or not.
Well, you point out.
Go ahead.
You point out that again, getting back to the statistical argument, that the 25 or 30 million concealed carry permit holders in the United States have an incredible record of safety, and they're virtually never the ones that commit murder or a gun crime.
Right. Well, I mean, the type of person who's willing to go through the process. I mean, if you're going to go and commit a crime, why are you going to bother going through the process, paying a fee, you know, doing the background check, getting training if it's required? You're just going to go and commit the crime. So it's, you know, it's my guess is the whole gun debate that we have right now would be very different if the media would cover a few things differently. One would be once in a while when we have these gun-free zones attacks, mention that that's occurring. It's often the easiest thing for the reporters to find out. Usually they'll go and talk about how people obtained the gun to begin with, or what gun was used. Frequently they're wrong. But, for something like the Texas school shooting, I was able to find that out within literally just a few minutes by just going to the website for the school to go and see their firearms policy that was there. The same with the Tulsa hospital shooting. So, these are not difficult things to go and find out, but you will search in vain to find those types of cases. Other instances would be on our website at crimeresearch.org. We have literally dozens of cases over the last few years where people with permitted concealed handguns have stopped what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting. But you will find that those usually only get local news coverage. And the few times that they do get national news coverage, the national news coverage often botches the story. We have the Parkland shooting. Few people would know that just a few months after that, there was an attempted school shooting at an elementary school gathering that was very close to Parkland. It was at a park right next to the school. A man came up, started firing his gun. Hundreds of students, parents, teachers were there. Fortunately, there was a vendor there with a permitted concealed handgun who stopped the attack. It only got local news coverage. You look at the Pulse nightclub shooting, which at the time was the worst mass public shooting in U.S. history. A week later, there was a similar attack at a nightclub in South Carolina. 3 people were shot. The 4th person was being shot at when a permit holder pulled out his gun and seriously wounded the attacker. Again, only local news coverage. The difference between Florida and South Carolina, Florida is one of 10 states that banned permitted concealed handguns in establishments that got more than 50% of their revenue from alcohol. South Carolina was one of the 40 states that allowed people to be able to have that. You would think both Parkland and the Pulse nightclub shooting were still getting coverage when these other events happened. And you would think, geez, we've just had another school shooting that ended very differently nearby, or a nightclub shooting that ended very differently, that it might get coverage, but they don't do it.
So it seems like all these laws are the costs of good intentions, or as an economist, the law of unintended consequence, or the seen and the unseen. I mean, you think
Right.
You're doing something good, you're going to ban guns in bars, well, that'll make it safer. Well, in fact, it does just the opposite. Let me touch a third rail here, if I might. It seems to me, as I read through your work, that there's an awful lot of distortions in average gun statistics in America, and that when you look specifically at what's happening in America's inner cities,
Right.
that most of the gun crimes are black on black murders. And so when people talk about average deaths, or average deaths of children even, they say, well, there are 15 children killed by guns every day. Well, in that, they include teenagers. And most of those gun crimes are gangland murders of kids in their teens. So we've got this notion that there's happening everywhere, but it's not happening everywhere. It's happening in the inner cities disproportionately.
Oh, yeah, no. Murders in the United States are very heavily concentrated, much more so than in other countries. You have over half the murders in the United States take place in about 2% of the counties. That's 60 out of the 3,140 counties. If you ever look at murder maps for those counties, what you'll find is that about 2/3 of those murders occur in 10-block areas. So murders are very heavily concentrated, and they're very, very heavily gang related. People fight against each other over controlling drug turf that's there. And you may have collateral damage, when you hear in Chicago, some 10-year-old girl that's been shot because of a drive-by shooting. Well, the drive-by shooting is almost invariably related to gangs fighting against each other over the drug turf. And there was some little girl that simply got caught in the crossfire that's there. Uh, we right now we hear all these statistics about the number of mass shootings in the United States, and they'll say that there's been over 200 of them. Usually, the way it's phrased to begin with is people will kind of bring up the Texas school shooting or the Buffalo shooting or others, and then they'll say there have been 200 mass shootings, making people think that there's basically 200 and some of those types of shootings. And that's simply very misleading because any type of death is bad, but the vast majority, I'd say in the high 80% range of those mass shootings that they talk about are gangs fighting against each other over drug turf. Is that bad? Yeah. But the causes and solutions for why gangs fight against each other over drug turf are dramatically different than these types of mass public shootings where somebody in a way to commit suicide, but in a way to commit suicide in order to get media attention and have people know that they were there, causes and solutions are dramatically different.
There are a lot of, we've had 187 kids murdered over the last 40, 50 years in school shootings. And this year in Chicago alone, there have been 254 people killed
right.
in Chicago. And Rich Daley is no longer mayor, but the mayor of Chicago is now worse. And it's just so maddening that these big city mayors want to have these gun control laws when they know the people most hurt by them are residents of the inner city.
Right.
Inner city, blacks, Hispanics, whatever. Those are the ones most hurt. And
they're hurt in many different ways. I mean, it's not just the direct victims of crimes, but who owns many of the businesses that are shut down or destroyed? Who works in those businesses? Who shops in those businesses? Who owns houses in those areas whose property value is knocked down as crime rates go up in those areas? These are overwhelmingly relatively low income blacks and Hispanics that are being harmed in many different ways there. And, you mentioned Daley. When the younger Daley became mayor, the arrest rate for murders were about 62% in the city. When he left, it was down to 30%. When Rahm Emanuel, who ended up leaving being mayor, it was down to 20%. It's been down to like the low teens since then. And there are lots of things that they've done which have made the job of arresting people much more difficult. So one of the things that's happened that Rahm Emanuel did was that whenever a police officer would stop and talk to somebody, they'd have to fill out paperwork. This is an agreement that he made with the ACLU. You have 2 pages, legal-sized pages of paperwork, talk about who you stopped, why you stopped them, where you talked to them about, what you talked to them about. And it would take like 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes to go and fill out the paperwork that's there. So you're a police officer and you talk to 4 people in the morning. Your afternoon is taken up filling out paperwork. What does that do to your incentive to even go and talk to people that's there? What does that do in terms of taking police officers off the street there? They've had this now for years. And as far as I know, nothing's ever come of them going and taking all that paperwork there. The ACLU thought, I guess, that they'd be able to bring lots of lawsuits and stuff with the information that they were gathering. But, again, this is the type of thing where there's been huge costs in terms of removing police from the streets. The thing is, so many Democrats claim that they care about poor and minority individuals, and yet they go and do things like this that really have real bad consequences. So, and just one quick point, and that is, we're living in a strange world where we have people who want to make sure that law enforcement's not able to go and defend people, and those same people don't want to let the individuals themselves defend themselves. You at least think that there'd be some trade-off there. If we're not going to let the police defend people, at least, or law enforcement, prosecutors, at least let the people themselves defend themselves, but they won't let either occur.
Well, I keep one. Maybe is there a third rail? Is there a fourth rail? I mean, I think a lot of this is political. If you look at the left-right divide and who owns guns and who doesn't own guns, it looks like a lot of this is aimed at taking guns from conservatives. And it's a little bit like the vaccines were used in the Pentagon to drive a lot of people out of special forces because they didn't want to vax, and it was almost a litmus test for who had the correct political beliefs or did not. And the guns are just a piece, a subset of that larger agenda, I think.
Right.
But let's go to the law enforcement and the police, because one of the things I mentioned at the outset, the behavior of the law enforcement officers in Texas, in Uvalde, was strange, and I haven't studied it, and I don't have the expertise to figure what they should have done or shouldn't done. Is there anything that because we've been demonizing police the way we have, that they were less likely to go in and do something?
Yeah, I don't know if that. My own belief is probably people are human, and we like to all think that if we were in that type of heroic situation, we'd run in and we'd save the day that's there. Not everybody's like that, and we may not be when it actually comes down to it. The bizarre thing was, police were waiting outside for over an hour. It finally ended because an off-duty Border Patrol agent, against orders, went in and rescued his family that was inside and killed the murderer that was there. But you have these calls from these young kids on their cell phones, and they're, pleading with somebody to come in and help them. And the murderer there's hearing them make phone calls and then killing the kids.
Yeah.
And it just rips your heart out to know that the officers were out there. But look, here's one of the reasons why it's important to have teachers and staff be able to go and carry. And that is, it's one thing to require somebody to have to run in to a dangerous situation, okay, to run towards the gunfire. But if you're a teacher or a staff person who's in the classroom, you have no choice. Either you go and defend yourself and your students that are there, or you're dead. It's not like you just can go and hide behind the desk that's there and everything's going to be fine. And so your incentive to actually go and use your ability, the whatever weapon you have, to stop the attack there, you have a very strong incentive to do that. And so at least a lot stronger than somebody from the outside to do it. And I have to say, one of the things, people point to, like the Buffalo case, the grocery store, where there was an armed guard that was there. And a lot of the gun control advocates will say, well, see, this proves that a good guy with a gun can't stop a bad guy with a gun. I've been writing about this for years. It's pretty frustrating, but if you have one person in uniform guarding a place, they have an incredibly difficult job. These attacks.
That person's also known as the target.
Yeah, exactly. Having one guy in uniform is kind of like a neon sign above him that says "Shoot me first," because if the killer believes that you're the only person with a gun there, who does he go after first? In the Buffalo attack, he had already cased the grocery store. He knew where the guard was stationed. The first person he killed was the guard. If you have one police officer at a school and he's in uniform, he's a very boring job. He's there day after day. The odds that any one school is going to get hit is incredibly low. And you don't have eyes in the back of your head. The attackers there have real tactical advantages there in terms of the timing, who they go after first. They can wait for you to leave the area, or they can go and pick another target, or they can take that person out first. And, it's just, if I were to make one plea, and that is because right now the Senate is talking about having funding for one police officer in each school. My plea would be, please mandate that the person not be in uniform. Please mandate that the person blend into the school. You can have them as a PE coach or as a janitor or something.
Like an air marshal on an airplane.
Yeah, something like that. But make it and have signs out in front of the school that say, rather than a gun-free zone, say, a selective people at the school have guns, concealed handguns, and will use them to protect the students and others here at the school. But you don't want to make the person identifiable.
So, sticking with the Congress and Senate and what's in this bill, have you done any work on the red flag laws?
Yeah.
What tell us about that?
Well, I don't think most people kind of know what the existing laws are, even before you have red flag laws. All the states and the federal government have what's called involuntary commitment type rules. And what happens is that if you are concerned about somebody being a danger to themselves or others, people will call up the police will go and investigate. If the police believe that they have, quote, a reasonable suspicion, which is like a 20% probability that there's a real concern there, they can take the person in for a mental health evaluation. You'll have, depending upon the state, any place from 1 to 3 mental health professionals that will evaluate the individual. And then if the mental health professionals believe that there is a concern there, there can be an immediate court hearing, literally an immediate court hearing. And if you can't afford a lawyer, one is provided for you. And then a judge has a range of options. The judge could say, look, I'm concerned, but if you agree to go and seek mental health counseling, then come back in a couple of weeks and we'll reevaluate the situation. They could take away the person's guns. They could go and involuntarily commit the person. There's a whole range of options that they have there. What red flag laws do is they essentially gut all those protections. What happens is that a complaint's made, a judge sees the written complaint in front of him. There's no testimony, there's no cross-examination. The person who the complaint is being leveled against doesn't even know that a complaint has been made. The first he'll know about it is when the police show up at 5 a.m. in the morning at his house to go and retrieve his guns. And then within a month or so, there'll be a hearing. No legal counsel is automatically provided to you. There's no mental health experts involved in the process in any of the states that are there. These red flag laws are overwhelmingly used for concerns about suicide. And the only thing that happens to you if you lose is your guns are taken away. Now, there are a couple points to make on this. One is, if you're concerned about somebody being suicidal, if you're really concerned about it, is simply taking away a person's guns a serious response to this? I mean, there's so many different ways people can commit suicide there. If you're concerned about it, you better get mental health care professionals involved, and you better maybe even think about involuntarily committing the guy if you're doing that. And but yet these laws do not have mental health care professionals involved. And the other thing is the costs. I've talked to lawyers involved in these types of hearings. The legal costs you're talking about are often $10,000. So let's say you're somebody who has a complaint against them. You want to keep your guns. But the only thing that happens to you if you lose is you lose your guns. And you have a choice. I may want to keep my guns, but is it worth $10,000 to go and change the odds? And so the vast majority of people who go through the process there don't hire a lawyer to go and deal with this. So I know the Senate is talking about having due process type protections in there, where there would be a hearing and stuff. That's fine. But it still doesn't get to the basic problem with red flag laws, and that is only concentrating on guns as a solution. I understand why gun control people want to frame it that way. They want to make people think, well, if you only take away the gun, then the problem's solved. But, unfortunately, I think it can actually be counterproductive sometimes. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted I want to just see if I can't boil this down. It's the old CEO in me. I can't.
Sure.
I want to.
I go on.
Like,
I'm an academic. I go on too long sometimes.
I love academics. That's why I'm part of the reasons I'm doing the show, to get to talk to smart people like you. But it seems like the essence of this is if you aim at the perpetrator or aim at the gun, the instrument, you don't end up producing any result. As you,
Exactly.
I think you've written, there are 2.5 million schizophrenics in the United States.
Right.
And half of the mass murders we've seen were already under some sort of psychiatric care. So that doesn't produce anything. Yet if you focus on people's ability to defend themselves, which would be concealed carry, and having plainclothes police in a school, and just a plainclothes policeman solves a problem where people say, "Oh, we can't give teachers concealed carry." Well, if you had one plainclothes cop in there, it seems to me like ability to defend knocks out 99% of the cases that would occur. Is that a fair summary of?
No, I think that's an excellent summary of what I've been saying. Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent summary.
How can we get the word out? Who are allies in this? I'm seeing you, and I've been unbelievably impressed with them. I mean, your books are fascinating. You look at them on Kindle, and it'll say you've got an hour left to go. Okay, that's fine. But then you look at the larger version of it, and you've got like 2/3 of the book is research and footnotes and cross references and studies. I mean, you've done more analysis of this than anybody on the other side of the gun control debate.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's been a long process. But,
who else do we have on our side? Let me see if I can't boil it down. How do we develop a consensus to get your point of view into more people's minds?
Right. Well, it's an interesting problem, and that is there's a lot of research that supports my side, academic research, but academics are afraid to go and speak out on this publicly because of the backlash that they'll get in many different ways. And, so they publish papers, and I can point to the papers, but, the thing is, the media has really changed over the last 10 or 20 years. So like, there'll be a paper that gets published that claims that concealed carry is bad. And there was another paper that had gotten published in a peer-reviewed journal even before that paper came out.
But when they said concealed carry is bad, I don't see anybody that has the kind of numbers that you have.
The thing is, when you do these studies, you're seeing how crime rates change in states that are changing their laws relative to all the other states that are there. And so the implicit assumption is that when a state changes its law during the period that you're looking at, adopting concealed carry, you're seeing a much bigger increase in the number of concealed carry permits in that state relative to the comparison groups that you have. The problem is that the later states are much more restrictive. Some of these states kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into having concealed carry, like Illinois, for example, was the last state to do it. It costs $450 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit, 16 hours of training. You're banned for most of the time for getting training in Chicago. You can't take it on public transportation. All sorts of restrictions that are there. And so, you compare Illinois to Indiana, neighboring Indiana, like 22% of the adult population is a concealed carry permit. In Illinois, it's like 4%. Well, it's simple. In Illinois, it costs $450. In Indiana, it costs $12.95. And you also see a change in the mix of who gets it. In Illinois, it's much more wealthy, suburban whites. In Indiana, it's much more inner city poor people that get concealed carry permits. But the point is that um, you have to really look at the percent of the population with permits, okay? Not just whether the law gets changed, because when you have these late states make it very difficult. They had an increase in permits, but you had an even larger increase in permits for the comparison group for the earlier years that are there. And so there, you would expect a bigger drop in crime for the early states, even though you think you're measuring just the change, what they would academics call a dummy variable for, just a 1-0 variable for the states that's there. So for over 20 years, I've been trying to argue, look, guys, when you look at this stuff, you really need to, these laws vary a lot across states. You really need to look at the percent change in the population with permits there to get an idea of how the risk for criminals is changing. And even better, look at what population groups, because if I have more permits for wealthy whites that live in the suburbs who aren't likely to be victims of violent crime, I'm not going to see the same impact on crime as I'm going to see if I have people who live in high crime urban areas
Right.
getting permits.
Right.
And so
you really can't compare. You can't compare Illinois with its demographics with Indiana and its demographics and see how much effect it would have.
Right.
Because it's not helping the people that it should help.
So I've tried to make that argument, but it's kind of like impervious to some people. And it's just, to me, some of these things just seem so obvious, but it's just, you do what you can on it. But the thing is also just the media. It's just, even 10 years, 20 years ago, there used to be this ethic in journalism where you'd interview people on both sides of an issue. You read the New York Times and Washington Post and stuff. But it just, I talk to my kids and I say, we'll be talking, one of them will go and say, well, Dad, look at this article in the New York Times. And I'll say, yeah, okay, I read it. And I said, and I'll say to him, do you really believe that there's only people on one side of the issue that this reporter could have interviewed? The reporter could have interviewed your dad, for example, as somebody who would have given something on the other side of this, because it'd be doing something with law enforcement or something. And it's just, I think a lot of people come away now these days thinking that there's really no argument to be made on the other side for these things. The thing is, even when reporters would interview people on both sides, they had lots of games that they could play. If you go and interview somebody for a half hour, there's certain things that the person being interviewed would make stronger statements than other statements. You could pick the weakest thing that you would put in there to say, well, I interviewed both sides. When you mentioned you looked at my book, The Bias Against Guns, one of the things that I looked at there, I'd gone through and looked at reporting on different things. The New York Times, for example, when they would go and do a news story on a new study on gun control. First of all, they'd only do news articles on gun control studies that kind of showed what they wanted to show. But then they would still interview people on both sides. But on the gun control side, they'd interview a couple of academics. On the other side, they'd interview somebody from the NRA and a gun store dealer. And it's kind of like, so you say, well, I interviewed people on both sides, but I mean, your reader's going to think, well, I have a couple, possibly unbiased academics, but a gun store dealer and the NRA.
And the NRA, oh my God, the NRA.
Yeah, right. I mean, how is that balanced?
Well, it's happening everywhere, John. The law schools now, Yale, you were there, in the law school now, there's a big movement saying they don't have to defend all type clients. It used to be everybody was entitled to advocacy and a lawyer, and now they're saying, well, if these people hold unacceptable views, they're not entitled to representation. That's a lot like what's going on here.
Right. Well, it's just part of the symphony.
Well, I'm going to take up that we've got to get the word out. We've got to get more people, because your books are unbelievably persuasive. Now, we can find you on guncontrol.org.
And on crimeresearch.org,
crimeresearch.org, and then you're appearing a lot on a lot of radio stations around the country. But I'm very, very happy you could be here. Unfortunately, we've got to wrap up, and I think you're going to catch a plane to go on vacation. So I want to let you get to that. So anyway, thanks for joining, John, and I think we'll continue with this. I hope sometime in the future when the next big thing comes up.
Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. This has been the Bill Walton Show, and as always, you can find us on Substack and YouTube and Rumble and all your major, wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Spotify, and hope you found this illuminating. I certainly did in doing the research, and I think we need to think about guns differently, and we need to think about guns in a way that say they can make us safer, and they're not that dangerous. So stay tuned for what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.